Yarana, hello. I just got back from vacation, my first trip ever to French Polynesia. It was incredible, an experience I'll never forget, an absolutely wonderful vacation in every way, almost. What my vacation was not was peaceful and quiet. If you're looking for a vacation spot where you can get some peace and quiet, French Polynesia may not be the place. You see, first thing in the morning, and I mean 4 a.m., you will awake to a chorus of crowing jungle roosters. They're loud, they're proud, they sing defiantly off key, and they do not care one little bit that you might be wanting more sleep. They sense that the sun is coming up and they must alert every living thing to that miracle as if it has never happened before and may never happen again, which for them it might not. Every few kilometers you can find a roadside vendor selling smoked chicken. Carpe diem, roosters. You may fall asleep again or not, but the rest of the day will be set to the soundtrack of every other bird on the island who will not let the roosters have the last word. It is a riot of sound and it is glorious, just not peaceful and not quiet. But peace and quiet are not always the same thing. We might tend to think of them as the same. The kids get too loud, shh, shh, shh. We shush them so we can have some peace and quiet, right? But forced quietness can be deceptive. Voices can be silenced, but beneath the silence, there may be something brewing that will eventually break through. This was the case in 1st century Palestine, the place where Jesus was born, which at the time was part of the Roman Empire. The Roman Emperor, Caesar Augustus, was revered by his loyalists who considered him savior of the world. Why? He had accomplished a feat no one before him had been able to do. He had managed to take control over a vast geographical region, most of the world as people knew it in that time and place, and a stunning military victory in Egypt ended decades of war in the Mediterranean. Hail Caesar, bringer of the peace, the Roman peace, the Pax Romana. However, all that glitters is not gold. The peace ushered in by Caesar was obtained and maintained through violence and oppression. One did not defy Caesar because his soldiers were everywhere, keeping the peace. So why might someone have wanted to defy Caesar? Because his policies were economically disastrous for all but the very rich, who worked with him to maintain the status quo. Everyone else sank into deeper misery and despair. People were forced to pay tribute to Caesar, taxes to King Herod, the local puppet king named King of the Jews by Caesar, and tithes to support the temple, which had been lavishly remodeled by King Herod in an effort to prove his greatness. It wasn't fair, but complaining about the leadership would earn you a traitor's death on a Roman cross. Best to keep quiet, keep the peace, or at least the illusion of it. But underneath, something was brewing, something even bigger than Caesar, which would not keep silent forever. Our gospel lesson today from the 1st chapter of Luke, which you should probably read, but I'll summarize, tells us the story of Zechariah, the country priest who reported to Jerusalem for his week of service at the great temple. It was an honor for Zechariah to go, and what is more, to be selected to burn the incense in the innermost temple, the holiest place, while crowds of faithful people waited outside praying. The pinnacle of his priestly career. But wait, there's more. While he was doing this, an angel of God appeared, telling Zechariah that he and his wife Elizabeth would have a son who would lead their people on the true path to God, preparing the way for a new thing God was about to do. It sounded too good to be true for an old man with no children who had long ago given up hope of having any. And Zechariah expressed reasonable doubt to the angel. "You sure about this? You gotta understand, my wife and I were old." That was the last thing poor Zechariah was able to say for over 9 months, for that angel took his voice and he would not regain it until after the birth of the miracle baby. During which time, Zechariah got to do a lot of listening, which is hard for a priest, someone used to doing a lot of talking. What did Zechariah hear once his own voice was silenced? Well, we learn from the Gospel of Luke that during Elizabeth's pregnancy, she receives a visit from an out-of-town cousin, a girl named Mary, who it just so happens is expecting herself. And funny coincidence, Mary has also been visited by that angel of God, same one who had visited Zechariah. And all Zechariah can do this time is listen as Mary tells of her experience, and Elizabeth affirms that the child she carries is indeed holy. She can feel it in her very womb, the way her child leaps. The two women talk about the wonderful things God is doing through their very bodies, bringing these special children into the world. They even sing together songs praising God for lifting up the lowly and bringing down the mighty, providing for the poor while sending the rich away empty. Songs of leveling the tall mountains and filling in the deep valleys so everyone is on level ground, having access to what they need. The women sing, and Zechariah listens, learning. This will be God's answer to their despair. God's peace will disrupt the Roman peace, bringing good news to the poor. Their voices would no longer be silenced. The women sang not soft songs to lull anyone to sleep, but songs of resistance, loudly proclaiming what justice looks like and sounds like. And even though it might have surprised Zechariah, it didn't sound like violence or insurrection. Mary and Elizabeth did not sing about retributive justice, but restorative justice, which is what their sons, John and Jesus, would offer to the world. A new song, a new way of understanding peace, not the false illusion of Roman peace, but God's peace. In the Advent book I'm reading, called The First Advent in Palestine, theologian Kelly Nikondeha writes, Mary sings out a new social order that upends the status quo as Advent begins to turn tables on those who benefit from the injustice of empires and their economies, long before her own son would himself overturn tables, enacting protest in the temple. Some songs soothe, others become subversive anthems to galvanize radical hope and future action. The song Mary sang was one of change already afoot. Together, Elizabeth and Mary, the mothers of Advent, shaped the infrastructure of peace. Peace, but not quiet. And all that priest could do was listen. I had a Zechariah moment while on my vacation. Like Zechariah, I went to the temple, the biggest, fanciest Protestant temple in Papeete, Tahiti. It was gorgeous, a marvel of stained glass and Polynesian woodworking. There was Jesus and John looking very Polynesian, represented in the stained glass above the high podium from which the pastor reigned. I had gone to worship with no big expectations. I knew I would not be lighting incense in the Holy of Holies, but I did imagine that I might lift my voice in worship and song. I speak French and I sing. Why wouldn't I join in? Well, little did I know the entire worship was done in Tahitian. All of it, the prayers, the readings, the preaching, the singing, not a word of French, and not a printed page in the room for me to stumble through a hymn. All music was memorized or presented by mini choirs throughout the sanctuary who had their own music. So I did what Zechariah did, not for 9 months, but for 90 minutes. I shut up and I listened and I learned. I learned how powerful the voice of the Spirit is when you let go of your need to control the outcome, to interrupt with your own voice, or even to understand. I learned how loud people can be when they feel safe to speak out, for this was a unique space, a very Polynesian space. I think I might have been the only person in that room of European descent, and for the very first time on my trip, I felt like no one was overly concerned about making me feel comfortable. No one was rude, quite the contrary, but it was very clear that time of worship was not about me and my experience. It was about a people praising God in the fullness of their native tongue, not the language they had been forced to learn by the French colonists. I did not need to understand their words, to understand the emotion behind their songs. The volume, the intensity, the emotion with which they sang God's praises, out of this world. These were not songs of peace and quiet, but songs claiming a deeper meaning of peace, God's peace, the kind of peace that reminds people that they belong to the God who chose to assume the human form of a helpless baby, born in a makeshift birthing room, to an impoverished girl who had just barely completed a forced relocation far from home. The songs of that Tahitian congregation reminded me of Mary's song, praising God for lifting up the lowly and bringing justice to her people. Why am I inferring so much about songs I couldn't even understand? Well, the simple fact that they were in Tahitian made them songs of resistance, because there was a time when the Tahitian language was actively discouraged, even forbidden in some contexts. Official business was only conducted in French, and schools were not allowed to teach or even use Tahitian until 1982, which means many Polynesians learned to be ashamed of their inherited language, and today there are some who do not speak it very well. Now, perhaps the idea was to create solidarity, to establish a linguistic bridge between the people of France and the people of French Polynesia. I would always like to assume some level of good intent, but it's kind of like the Roman peace, isn't it? A sort of forced cohesion, suppressing people's voices and identities. I was talking about this with a taxi driver, and he told me that during the years when Tahitian was prohibited in official spaces, his childhood in fact, the only place children could go to learn their language was church. Sunday schools taught children the language of their ancestors, and to this day, many Polynesian churches continue worshiping God only in their native tongue. People may speak French at work, at school, and even some at home, mix and match, but they use Tahitian in their worship and in their singing. Every hymn a redemption song. It's not angry, it's not vindictive, it's just the song of a people reclaiming their value, voicing their presence, and praising the God who made them Polynesian. Now, the story of Polynesia is the story of colonialism, an old story which keeps being repeated across time and space. Our country has its own version of this story, don't we? Generations of indigenous children forcibly removed from their families, sent to boarding schools so they could be taught to speak English and live like Americans of European descent. That officially stopped about 50 years ago, but it'll take many more years for the wounds to heal. Now, the idea was to create a unified way of living in the United States, but kind of like the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, it was devastating to those whose voices were silenced. God's peace sings a different song, not in unison, but in rich harmonies and in many languages. We could learn a lot from the past, couldn't we? And yet today, in the very land where Jesus was born, there is conflict. Children die of hunger in makeshift tents, while powerful leaders use them as pawns in a real-life chess game. It's deeper than control of language or religion or culture. It's genocide. And any hope of peace needs to take into account that peace is more than the absence of conflict or forced surrender. Peace, by God's definition, is called shalom, meaning everyone given access to what they need to thrive. Peace looks like justice, not for some, but for all. Is this possible? God seemed to think so, choosing an equally volatile time and place for Jesus' birth. Our Advent story is our reminder that God's way is to disrupt the illusory peace gained by suppression and violence and invite us into a deeper understanding of peace in which all voices are heard, all children are fed, all people are cherished, all languages are spoken, and all needs are met. It might be a little bit loud, but that's okay. Everyone deserves to sing their own songs in their own way, even the roosters at 4 a.m., which I finally accepted when I recalled the words of Robert Frost. I have wished a bird would fly away and not sing by my house all day, have clapped my hands at him from the door when it seemed as if I could bear no more. The fault must partly have been in me. The bird was not to blame for his key. And of course, there must be something wrong in wanting to silence any song. Peace be with you, my friends. God's peace. Shalom.